Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, my name is Marcus, and every week we sit down together and we peel back the layers on some of the most haunting, most baffling, most deeply disturbing criminal cases that have ever unfolded on American soil. Cases where the truth got buried under years of silence. Cases where families spent decades waiting by phones that never rang with the answers they deserved. Cases where detectives retired with the weight of unsolved murders pressing down on their chests every single night. And today's case is no different. In fact, I'd argue that today's case is one of the most chilling cold cases I have ever covered on this channel. So please make sure you are subscribed, hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, and without any further delay, let's talk about the murder of Jennifer Lynn Marsh, a 26-year-old school teacher from Clearwater, Florida, whose life was stolen from her on a warm October evening in 1997, a case that went cold almost immediately, that baffled investigators for over 2 decades, and that only recently began to crack open again thanks to cutting-edge DNA technology and one retired detective who simply refused to let Jennifer be forgotten. To understand this case, you really have to understand Jennifer herself, because Jennifer Lynn Marsh was not just another victim. She was a human being with a full, vibrant, deeply meaningful life. And the people who knew her will tell you that losing her was like losing the sun from the sky. She was born on March 14, 1971, in Clearwater, Florida, the second of 3 children born to Robert and Patricia Marsh, her father a retired naval officer and her mother a registered nurse. Jennifer grew up in a modest 3-bedroom house on Palmetto Street, in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and parents sat on porches drinking iced tea and watching the seasons turn. Jennifer was the kind of kid who brought home stray cats and cried at the end of movies and spent her Saturday mornings volunteering at the local animal shelter. She was deeply empathetic from the time she was very small. Her mother, Patricia, would later tell investigators that Jennifer had this extraordinary ability to walk into a room and immediately sense who was hurting and go straight to that person and sit with them, and that quality never left her as she grew up. She graduated from Clearwater High School in 1989, and there's a photograph from her graduation day that her family still keeps framed on the living room wall. Jennifer in her blue cap and gown, her dark brown hair loose around her shoulders, her smile so wide and so genuine that it practically leaps off the paper. And you look at that photo and you think about everything that was ahead of her in that moment, all the years she had no idea she was counting down, and it just breaks your heart. She went on to attend the University of South Florida in Tampa, where she majored in elementary education. She was the kind of student who stayed after class to ask questions, not because she needed to, but because she was genuinely curious. She tutored other students on weekends. She organized a literacy drive on campus during her junior year. She was the person who remembered everyone's birthday and brought homemade baked goods to study group sessions. By all accounts, Jennifer Marsh was simply good. Not performatively good, not good for show, but genuinely and quietly and consistently good in the way that the world desperately needs and too rarely gets. After graduating in 1993, she returned to Clearwater and took a job teaching 3rd grade at Sand Key Elementary School. And by all accounts, she was extraordinary at it. Her classroom was one of those classrooms that kids cried about leaving at the end of the year, the kind where parents specifically requested their child be placed with Miss Marsh. She decorated her room with the kids' artwork and kept a little reading corner with beanbag chairs and fairy lights and stacks of picture books. She learned every child's specific interests within the first 2 weeks of school so she could tailor her lessons to things they actually cared about. A boy who was obsessed with dinosaurs would find dinosaur math problems on his worksheet. A girl who loved horses would get a reading assignment about wild mustangs. That level of care and attention is not something you fake, that is something you are. And Jennifer Marsh was that, completely and without reservation. By 1997, Jennifer was 26 years old and living in a small but cheerful apartment on Bel Air Road, about 4 miles from the school where she taught.
She had a rescue cat named Pumpkin and a collection of vintage paperbacks and a habit of going for long runs along the waterfront on Sunday mornings. She had a close circle of friends, several of whom she had known since childhood, and she was, by all accounts, happy, genuinely happy. She had recently begun dating a man named Derek Hollis, a 29-year-old electrician who worked for a local contracting company. Their relationship was described by friends as warm and easy and affectionate. They had been together for about 5 months at the time of Jennifer's murder, and Derek would spend years afterward haunted by the events of October 9th, 1997, the last evening he ever saw her alive. That Thursday evening, Jennifer had dinner with Derek at a small Italian restaurant called Bella Notte on Cleveland Street. Friends who saw them there described them as relaxed and happy, laughing, sharing a bottle of wine. They left the restaurant around 9:15 in the evening. Derek walked Jennifer to her car in the parking lot. They said goodnight, he watched her drive away, and that was the last confirmed sighting of Jennifer Lynn Marsh alive. She never arrived home. Her car was found the following morning by a jogger parked crookedly on a gravel pull-off along a stretch of Ulmerton Road that bordered a scrubby wooded area known locally as Barker's Tract, a 70-acre parcel of undeveloped land that had been the subject of various development disputes over the years and was largely avoided by the public because it had no maintained trails and was thick with palmetto scrub and drainage ditches. The car's engine was off. The keys were in the ignition. Jennifer's purse was on the passenger seat, with her wallet and phone still inside. There were no signs of a struggle in or immediately around the vehicle. Jennifer's body was discovered approximately 200 yards into Barker's Tract at 11:47 that Friday morning by Clearwater Department police officers who had responded to the report of the abandoned vehicle. She was found lying face down in a shallow depression near a drainage ditch, partially concealed by a dense cluster of palmetto fronds. She had been strangled. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been killed sometime between 10 p.m. on the night of October 9th and 2 a.m. on the morning of October 10th. There was evidence of a violent struggle. Jennifer had defensive wounds on both hands and forearms, indicating she had fought back hard against her attacker. There was biological material recovered from under her fingernails, material that investigators hoped would eventually tell them exactly who had done this to her. There was also a partial boot print found in the soft earth near her body, consistent with a men's size 11 work boot, and a single distinctive fiber recovered from her clothing, a dark green synthetic fiber of a type consistent with certain makes of carpet or upholstery used in vehicles manufactured in the mid-1990s. The early days of the investigation moved quickly in the way that murder investigations always do when the body is fresh and the leads are still warm. Detectives from the Clearwater PD's homicide unit immediately focused on the people closest to Jennifer, which is always where you start. Statistically speaking, it is far more likely that a victim knows their killer than that they are attacked by a stranger. And so Detective Raymond Kowalski and his partner, Detective Sylvia Fontaine, began working outward from Jennifer's inner circle. Derek Hollis was interviewed extensively and voluntarily submitted to a polygraph examination, which he passed. He had a verifiable alibi for the entire window of Jennifer's murder. Multiple witnesses placed him at a bar called the Rusty Pelican with 3 friends until almost 1 in the morning on the night Jennifer was killed. Phone records confirmed he had made several attempts to reach Jennifer by phone that evening, starting around 10:30 when she didn't call him as they had apparently planned. The calls went unanswered. Derek had reported his concern to a mutual friend before the car was even found the next morning. Other people in Jennifer's life were also examined closely. Her colleagues at Sand Key Elementary, former boyfriends, neighbors, the parents of students she taught, anyone who might have had access to her, anyone who might have had a grievance against her. And here, investigators hit a wall that would define the case for years, because Jennifer Marsh simply did not appear to have enemies. She had no bitter exes with violent histories, no feuds with neighbors, no financial disputes, no threatening correspondence, Nothing. She was, by every conceivable measure, a person whose life was oriented entirely around kindness and connection and community. And the idea that someone had wanted to hurt her badly enough to follow her from a restaurant parking lot and kill her in a dark wooded area did not fit with anything investigators could find in the landscape of her life. Which led investigators to consider the possibility that this was stranger violence, a terrifying category of crime precisely because it is so much harder to solve. With no pre-existing relationship between victim and perpetrator, there are no phone records to pull, no shared social circles to interview, no financial threads to trace. You are essentially looking for a ghost. And in 1997, without the forensic tools that investigators have today, finding that ghost was extraordinarily difficult. The DNA recovered from under Jennifer's fingernails was submitted to the FBI's then-nascent CODIS database, but returned no matches. The fiber evidence went nowhere definitive. The boot print was photographed and cataloged, but could not be linked to any specific individual. The case generated significant local media attention in the weeks following Jennifer's murder. Clearwater police received dozens of tips from the public, some of them credible sounding enough to investigate, none of them ultimately leading anywhere solid. One tip that investigators pursued aggressively in those early weeks involved a man named Gary Pruitt, a 34-year-old with a prior conviction for aggravated assault, who had been seen in the vicinity of Barker's Tract on multiple occasions and who had no solid alibi for the night of October 9th. Pruitt was brought in for questioning. He was combative and evasive during the interview, which naturally elevated investigators' suspicion. His apartment was searched, and while investigators found evidence of drug use and an extensive collection of hunting and camping equipment, they found nothing that directly linked him to Jennifer's murder. No dark green fibers matching the sample recovered from her clothing, no boots matching the print found at the scene, no DNA connection. Pruitt was released. He remained a person of interest for several years, but nothing concrete ever materialized against him. He died of a heart attack in 2009 at the age of 46, taking whatever secrets he may or may not have held entirely with him. By 1999, 2 years after Jennifer's murder, the case had effectively gone cold. The detectives who had worked it most intensively had moved on to other investigations. The tips from the public had slowed to a trickle and then stopped entirely. The Marsh family had buried their daughter and were trying, in the way that grieving families do, to build some kind of structure around the enormous absence she had left behind. Patricia Marsh, Jennifer's mother, channeled her grief into advocacy. She began attending meetings of a Florida victim advocacy group called Families for Justice. She wrote letters to the Clearwater Police Department every year on October 9th, the anniversary of Jennifer's murder, asking what, if anything, was being done to solve her daughter's case. The responses were always polite and always essentially the same. The case remains open. All available investigative leads have been pursued. We have not forgotten Jennifer, but there were no new developments to report. Year after year, there were no new developments to report. Robert Marsh, Jennifer's father, struggled differently. He was a man of a generation and a temperament that did not easily accommodate the expression of grief. He had spent 22 years in the Navy, and he had built his identity around discipline and forward motion, and not allowing himself to be destroyed by things he could not control. And the murder of his daughter nearly destroyed him anyway. He began drinking heavily in the years following her death. He and Patricia separated in 2003, though they never formally divorced. They remained in contact, bound by their shared grief and their shared need to keep Jennifer's memory alive. Robert would sit in his apartment on Friday evenings and watch old home video recordings of Jennifer as a child, her birthday parties, Christmas mornings, a summer vacation to Myrtle Beach when she was 11 and had her first taste of soft-serve ice cream, and reacted with such pure and uncomplicated delight that it made everyone around her laugh. He watched those videos over and over in the dark, and he tried to hold on to her. And then there was a detective named Raymond Kowalski, the lead investigator on Jennifer's case in 1997, who retired from the Clearwater Police Department in 2008 after 28 years of service, and who could not let it go. Kowalski was 61 years old when he retired, and he had worked hundreds of cases in his career. And Patricia had shown him a photograph of Jennifer at her classroom, surrounded by her third graders, all of them beaming, Jennifer's face alight with something that looked like pure joy. And Kowalski had looked at that photograph and had made a private promise to himself that he was going to find out who did this. A promise he technically had 28 years on the job to keep, but that he found himself still honoring in retirement, still turning the case over in his mind, still reviewing the files he had kept copies of, still reading everything he could find about advances in forensic technology. Because by the early 2010s, something extraordinary was happening in the world of forensic science. DNA technology was advancing at a pace that would have seemed almost science-fictional to investigators working cases in the 1990s, and a technique called forensic genealogy, or genetic genealogy, was beginning to emerge as a revolutionary tool for solving cold cases. The basic concept is this. If you have a DNA sample from a crime scene, even a degraded or partial sample, you can upload that DNA profile to consumer ancestry databases like GEDmatch, where people voluntarily upload their own genetic data for genealogical research. And by finding distant relatives of your unknown suspect in those databases, you can begin to build a family tree and work backward to identify individuals who fit the profile. The technique had been used to spectacular effect in several high-profile cases, most notably the identification of the so-called Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, in 2018, and its success had triggered a surge of interest among cold case investigators across the country. In 2019, Kowalski made a phone call. He reached out to a contact he had maintained at the Clearwater Police Department, a younger detective named Amber Cruz, who had taken a particular interest in cold cases and who had been following developments in forensic genealogy closely. Together, they began the process of petitioning the department to have the biological evidence from Jennifer Marsh's case reanalyzed using modern techniques. This was not a simple process. It required navigating departmental bureaucracy and budgetary considerations and questions about chain of custody and evidence preservation. But Kowalski was persistent and Cruz was determined. And eventually, in the spring of 2020, the department agreed to submit the DNA sample recovered from under Jennifer's fingernails to a specialized forensic laboratory for retesting and potential genealogical analysis. The results came back in stages over the following months, and each stage was both encouraging and agonizing in the way that investigative breakthroughs often are when you have been waiting for them for 23 years. The first report confirmed that the DNA sample was viable. It had degraded over the decades, but a complete enough profile could be extracted for genealogical purposes, which was the first genuinely good news the case had produced since 1997. The second stage involved uploading that profile to GEDmatch and waiting for potential familial matches to emerge. And this is where the work became both technically sophisticated and deeply human, because genealogical research is ultimately the work of reconstructing lives, tracing the movements of real people through birth records and marriage certificates and obituaries and census data, following the branches of family trees across generations and geographies. The genealogist who was brought in to assist with the case was a woman named Dr. Sandra Lowe, a retired academic who had transitioned into forensic genealogy work after spending 30 years as a professor of genetic anthropology at the University of Florida. Dr. Lowe was meticulous and systematic and had a gift for the lateral thinking that genealogical research demands. The work she did over the following 8 months was extraordinary. She began with a cluster of moderate-strength DNA matches that the database returned, individuals who shared enough genetic material with the unknown sample to suggest they were second or third cousins of the unknown contributor. And from those matches, she began building outward, constructing a family tree that would eventually encompass hundreds of individuals across multiple branches, cross-referencing census records, death certificates, voter registration data, driver's license records, and geographic information about where family members had lived over the decades. The critical breakthrough came in January of 2021 when Dr. Lowe identified a specific branch of the family tree that kept producing male members who had lived in the Clearwater area in the late 1990s. She narrowed the field to a list of 7 men who fit the basic parameters: male, old enough in 1997 to have committed the crime, geographically proximate at the time, and investigators began the painstaking process of eliminating candidates. Some were eliminated through DNA comparison, relatives who agreed to voluntarily provide cheek swabs. Some were eliminated through alibi verification. Some had died. Some had moved out of state decades earlier and had verifiable histories placing them elsewhere. And then there were 2. 2 men remaining on the list after all others were accounted for, and one of them was a man named Thomas Edward Bridger. Thomas Bridger was 41 years old in October of 1997. He had lived in Dunedin, a small city directly adjacent to Clearwater at the time of the murder. He had worked for a landscaping company. He had been married briefly in the early 1990s. The marriage had ended in divorce in 1995. His ex-wife had subsequently filed a police report alleging harassment. That report had never resulted in charges, but it was there in the record, a small red flag waving quietly in a file that no one had ever connected to Jennifer Marsh's murder because no one had ever had a reason to look at Thomas Bridger. By 2021, he was 65 years old and living in a retirement community in Ocala, Florida, about 90 miles north of Clearwater. He was, by outward appearances, an unremarkable elderly man. He played cards with neighbors, he attended church on Sundays, he had a daughter from his marriage with whom he had a distant but cordial relationship. Nothing about Thomas Bridger in 2021 would have caused anyone who didn't know what investigators now suspected to look at him twice. But investigators needed confirmation. They could not simply arrest Thomas Bridger on the basis of genealogical inference, however well constructed. They needed to confirm that the DNA from Jennifer's fingernails actually belonged to him. And to get that confirmation, they needed to obtain his DNA without tipping him off to the investigation, which required a technique that law enforcement has used in several genealogy-assisted cold cases, the so-called trash pull. Investigators essentially retrieved discarded items from a suspect's garbage that may contain biological material, items like coffee cups, cigarette butts, used tissues, anything from which a DNA sample can be extracted without the subject's knowledge or consent. This is legally permissible in the United States under the doctrine that individuals have no reasonable expectation of privacy in garbage they have placed at the curb for collection. Detective crews traveled to Ocala in February of 2021 and over the course of 2 separate early morning visits retrieved several items from Bridger's trash, including a paper coffee cup and a plastic water bottle, both of which were immediately submitted to the forensic laboratory for DNA extraction and comparison. And then she waited. She and Kowalski both waited. They had told themselves not to get too far ahead of the evidence. They had been disappointed before in this case, and they had seen what those disappointments did to the families, and so they tried to hold themselves in a disciplined suspension, hoping but not expecting, waiting for the science to do what the science does. The results came back on March 3, 2021, 23 years, 4 months, and 22 days after Jennifer Lynn Marsh was murdered in Barker's tract. The DNA extracted from the paper coffee cup recovered from Thomas Bridger's trash was a match to the DNA recovered from under Jennifer's fingernails in 1997. It was definitive. It was unambiguous. It was him. Thomas Edward Bridger had killed Jennifer Marsh. He had wrapped his hands around her throat on a warm October night and taken her life, and then driven away and built 23 years of ordinary existence on top of that fact. And now the science had found him. Bridger was arrested on March 9, 2021, at his home in the Ocala retirement community. The arrest was made early in the morning, before most of his neighbors were awake. He was taken into custody without incident. He appeared confused at first, and then, according to the officers present, something shifted in his expression, something that one detective later described as a kind of terrible relief, as though a weight he had been carrying for over 2 decades had finally, against all his expectations, been put down. He was transported to Pinellas County, where he was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jennifer Lynn Marsh. In the days following the arrest, investigators began to reconstruct what had happened on the night of October 9, 1997. They could not interview Bridger. He had immediately retained an attorney and declined to speak with police. But the physical and circumstantial evidence, along with the DNA match and the genealogical work that had led investigators to him, began to tell a story. At the time of Jennifer's murder, Bridger had driven a 1994 Ford F-150 pickup truck, a truck with dark green carpet in the cab, consistent with the fiber recovered from Jennifer's clothing. Investigators confirmed this through vehicle registration records. The truck had been sold in 1999 and had passed through several hands before being junked in 2006, but the records were clear. Bridger had owned it in 1997. As for why Jennifer Marsh, investigators believe, based on the totality of the evidence, that this was, in fact, stranger violence, that Bridger had followed Jennifer from the restaurant parking lot or encountered her at some point during her drive home, that the abduction had occurred either while her car was stopped at a red light or possibly at a secondary stop she made that investigators cannot definitively account for. There was a convenience store approximately a mile from Bellinote that Jennifer sometimes stopped at, and while the store's security footage from that night no longer exists, investigators believe it is possible she was targeted there. Bridger's landscaping work took him through many Clearwater neighborhoods, and it is likely he had simply seen Jennifer before that night, though whether the attack was truly random or whether he had noticed her on a prior occasion remains unknown. The trial of Thomas Edward Bridger began in September of 2022 and lasted 11 days. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the fiber evidence, the genealogical work that had led investigators to Bridger, testimony from Dr. Sandra Lowe about the methodology and reliability of forensic genealogy, and testimony from several individuals who had known Bridger in the mid-1990s, including a former co-worker who described Bridger as having a disturbing fixation on women who he perceived as rejecting him, and who recalled a specific incident in which Bridger had made threatening comments about a female acquaintance who had refused his romantic advances. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was contaminated, that the genealogical methodology was unreliable, that their client was an old man with no criminal record who was being railroaded by circumstantial inference dressed up in scientific clothing. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Thomas Edward Bridger was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on November 14, 2022. He showed no visible emotion when the sentence was read. He was 66 years old. The judge looked at him for a long moment before speaking and said that Jennifer Lynn Marsh had been 26 years old, with decades of life ahead of her and decades of good she would have done in the world, and that Thomas Bridger had taken all of that from her and from everyone who loved her, and that the sentence he was receiving was not punishment enough for what he had done, but that it was the most the law could provide, and that the court hoped it gave Jennifer's family some measure of peace. Patricia Marsh was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was 73 years old. Her hair had gone completely white, and she moved more slowly than she once had. And when the foreman said the word guilty, she simply closed her eyes and sat very still for a moment. And then she reached out and took the hand of the woman sitting next to her, a victim's advocate who had been supporting the family through the trial, and she held it. She did not cry right then. She had cried so many times in 25 years that perhaps there was a kind of exhaustion past weeping. But later, in the hallway outside the courtroom, she spoke briefly to a handful of reporters, and what she said was simple and devastating. She said that Jennifer was the best thing she had ever done in her life, and that she had spent 25 years just wanting someone to say her name in a courtroom and call what happened to her a crime, and hold someone accountable for it. And now that had happened, and she was grateful. She said she was grateful.
Robert Marsh had died in 2018, 3 years before Bridger was arrested. He had never gotten the answer he had spent the last 20 years of his life hoping for. He had gone to his grave not knowing who had killed his daughter. And that is one of the hardest parts of this story, the parts of it that no verdict can fix. The years that families spend in that particular limbo of unresolved grief, not able to move fully into mourning because the open wound of the unknown keeps them suspended in a kind of permanent shock. Robert Marsh had done his best. He had loved his daughter as much as a person can love anyone, and he had never stopped wanting justice for her. And he had never gotten to sit in that courtroom and hear the word guilty spoken about the man who had done it. And you have to hold that, too, when you think about what cold cases cost. You have to count the people who died waiting. Detective Raymond Kowalski attended the sentencing. He was 75 years old, and he had been retired for 14 years, but he sat in the third row of that courtroom in Clearwater, and he watched Thomas Bridger be sentenced to life in prison. And when it was over, he walked out into the Florida sunshine, and he stood there for a minute, an old man squinting into the light. And a journalist who was there said later that he looked like someone who had finally been able to put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time, because that is exactly what it was. That is the thing about the detectives who refuse to let cold cases go. They carry those cases, they carry those victims, they carry that weight through their retirements and their later years, and sometimes all the way to their own ends. And when justice finally comes, it does not erase all those years of carrying, but it does allow for something like release, something like breath, something like peace. Jennifer Lynn Marsh's classroom at Sand Key Elementary School was renamed in her honor by the school district in 2023. It is called the Jennifer Marsh Room, and it has been converted into a reading resource center, the kind of cozy, inviting, book-filled space that Jennifer would have loved, and that she would have spent hours in with her students. There are photographs of her on the wall, and one of them is that graduation photo, the one in the blue cap and gown with the enormous smile. And kids who use that room every day walk past that photo without knowing all of the story behind it. They just see a smiling young woman and maybe wonder briefly who she was. And that is both heartbreaking and somehow right, because Jennifer Marsh was at her core someone who wanted to make spaces where children felt safe and loved and excited about learning. And now she still is, in that room, in that way. She still is. This case is a testament to a few things that I think are worth sitting with as we close out today's episode. It is a testament to the tenacity of people like Raymond Kowalski and Amber Cruz and Sandra Lowe, who refused to accept that this crime would go unanswered, who kept pushing and kept working long after most people would have moved on. It is a testament to the extraordinary power of forensic genealogy, a tool that has now helped solve hundreds of cold cases across the United States, and that has given families like the Marsh family the answers they thought they might never receive. It is a testament to Patricia Marsh and to every family member of every cold case victim who writes letters and attends meetings and keeps saying the name of someone the world might otherwise forget. The advocacy of families is not incidental to the solving of cold cases. It is often the thing that keeps those cases alive long enough for the technology to catch up to the crime.
And it is a testament to Jennifer herself, to the kind of person she was, to the fullness and the brightness of her 26 years. Because ultimately, every cold case is a story about a person, not just a crime. And I think it matters enormously that we tell those stories in a way that puts the person at the center. Jennifer Marsh was not just a body in a wooded lot on Omerton Road. She was a teacher who made her students feel seen and celebrated. She was a daughter who made her parents proud. She was a friend who showed up. She was a young woman who had decades of good work ahead of her and who deserved the chance to do it. And Thomas Bridger took that from her. And the fact that he spent 23 years walking free is a horror that no sentence can fully reckon with. But the fact that Jennifer's story did not end with a file in a cold case cabinet is something. It is not everything, but it is something. And it is what we have. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. I know this one was heavy, and I appreciate you staying with me all the way through it. If you want to learn more about forensic genealogy and how it is being used to solve cold cases across the country, I have linked some resources in the description below, including information about the DNA Doe Project, an extraordinary volunteer organization that uses genetic genealogy to identify unidentified human remains. Please consider supporting them if this kind of work resonates with you. And please, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling me what you thought of today's case. Your engagement genuinely helps this channel reach more people and helps more of these stories get told. Until next time, please take care of yourselves and each other, and never forget that the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of finding its way out into the light.